Hi, good evening and welcome. Thank you all for joining us in this webinar on affordable housing in India, part of the outreach series for the new master's and PhD programs at IIHS University. Our five master's programs are open for admissions right now, and the deadlines are still 9 days away till the 20th of March. So, a good time to tune in and use today to get a taste of what thinking and learning at IIHS is like. So let me introduce myself and my colleagues. My name is Gautam Bhan. I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Human Development at IIHS University, and my work has been on questions of affordable housing, housing policy, and also neighborhood and the upgrading of vulnerable settlements. Namrata?
Hi, I'm Namrata Kapoor. I'm lead academics research at IIHS University. I work on questions of affordable housing. I work on transit-oriented development and planning for economic geographies, and I teach at IIHS.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Sai Rama Raju Marella. I'm a researcher and I teach at IIHS University. Over here, my research focuses on affordable housing, rental housing. Rental housing specifically focus on like low-income shade rental housing, which focus on migrant blue-collar workers. And I teach housing elective and like a couple of other things in university.
Great. So the three of us who are part of the housing team at IHS in many ways are going to spend the next hour with you talking about questions of affordable housing in our cities. And the idea is for you to get a sense of some of the ways we think at IHS about housing and also some of the ways that you could learn and study and be part of our work. The format of the webinar is that you have a Q&A box in front of you that you can use at any time to enter your questions. Don't use the chat box. We'll be tracking the Q&A box. So that's one thing to do, and you can put them in at any time. And we will open up for about 35, 40 minutes between us right now in a conversational format that I'll be moderating, and Namrata and Sai will be giving all the knowledge in the yard. And then after that, we'll take questions from you. So let's get started, guys. So one of the things when we think about, we hear this question of affordable housing a lot. And I think everyone that's on this webinar has felt the pang of not worrying about affording a house. And actually, one of the strange things about affordability in our context is that it feels both extreme because we can see the inadequacies in housing, but it's felt almost entirely through the housing market. It's not like at the upper end of the housing market, there are not crises of affordability. And we use this word crisis a lot. And one of the things we've always said is that we should always be specific when we talk about a crisis. Otherwise, it's everything and nothing. So let's start there, right? Let's start by actually breaking down the terms of each of this affordable housing crisis that we have to solve. So take the first part. So many definitions of affordability, so many ways to think about it. So, Namrata, if I start with you, how would you have folks that are joining us think about how should we begin to define affordable housing?
Yeah, that's a really important question because, sometimes you pick up the newspaper and, it says affordable housing being built in so and so place. And then you actually go through the article and it's like some 1 crore house, which is, coming up somewhere. And this is usually the supply side, developer understanding of affordable housing. And it varies from like place to place. Once when I was speaking to a developer in Bangalore, he said, we think of affordable housing around like 65 lakhs in Bangalore. And you'll see that RBI also kind of closely aligns itself to the supply side definition, of course, because they're giving loans. They work on the loan side. But if you come at it from the demand side, which most housing policy actually does, affordability is a spectrum. So in 2008, there was the high-level task force on affordable housing, which had, also called the Deepak Parekh report, which kind of defines affordability as 4 to 5 times your gross household annual income.
So like a ratio of the full earning of the household for the year.
Yeah. And so what that means is basically that if you belong to, let's say, the economically weaker section, which PMAY defines as, people who are earning up to 3 lakh per, as household income per year, then you would be able to afford a house which is up to 12 lakh, so 4 times 3. Right. But the thing is that this is up to, right? So EWS section is again a spectrum, and so you could be somewhere somebody who's earning, let's say, 1 lakh, and then you can only afford up to like 4 lakhs. So this is a spectrum, and you have to understand it in that way. And majority of our affordable housing, our housing demand is actually in the EWS and LIG section. So somewhere between, 24 lakhs and under is what.
So I think it's so striking, right? You come in from the demand developer side and you're saying 60 lakhs. You're coming at it from people who actually earn what people actually have, and you're like 10 lakhs.
Yeah.
And there's that first crisis, which is 10 and 60 are completely different numbers. And I think it's useful for all of us here. I mean, imagine the cities that you live in. Imagine what a 60 lakh house looks like, and imagine what a 10 lakh house looks like, and imagine where it is and what it looks like and what it's built of. And you begin to sort of see some of the tensions. Some of the tensions are actually, even before we get to the market, some of the tensions are in the definitions. It's in our conceptual understanding of it as well, right? Is this set of ratio that works out in such different ways?
No, and absolutely. And we are just offering a definition that we work with in the practice team. If you actually start going through what RAI said was, affordable housing was a PMAY1, was a PMA. These keep changing over time. Yeah.
No, and that's something. And Sai, and one of the things about affordability, so say you have 10 to 60 and you have a whole set of folks who are not even entering this market, right? So, I mean, if we think about a majority of urban Indian residents working in the informal economy, you're thinking construction workers, street vendors, auto rickshaw drivers, right? Folks who are good working family folks, not even folks that are BPL, right? 60 lakhs is not a game that they're playing. So surely there's then a lot of non-ownership housing happening. So when you start thinking about rent, how does that change the idea of affordable housing outside just buying in the market and ownership?
Yeah, I mean, outside ownership and housing, like I'll just continue Namrata's introduction on there are a bunch of committees and reports like Kundu Committee and like Parik Committee reports talks about the rental expenditure to income is almost like 30%. So 30% of your income, like for example, someone is earning 10,000 rupees. 30% is like they'll pay 3,000 rupees as rent. That, I mean, statistically and like theoretically, it's really good. But on ground, when we have did study and also a couple of NSS and like other reports, when you've seen, the trend is roughly between 12 to 18%. And that 12 to 18% is also coming mostly from it depends from the size and scale of the city. Like it's varying. And that's when your question comes up, like, what about these folks who are in the informal economy, or like folks who are earning, and like street vendors, hawkers, and all these folks? Again, like on top of it, most of them are migrants. And like we are not sure whether they are like interstate migrants, intrastate migrants. Are they, or some, most of the time they are also like seasonal migrants.
So that's an interesting number. So you're saying that what evidence tells us about our cities is that for, say you earn 100 rupees a month, right? Say you earn a more familiar figure, let's say 15,000. Minimum wage is 15,000 in many places, 18,000, right? 20,000. So at 20,000, I'm paying up to about 3,000 rupees in rent, somewhere almost around there, right? So there's this sort of, so rent becomes a kind of proportion. So here we had a 4:5 times annual household income asset type ratio. And here you have how much of my monthly rent is going out in that question. But I'm also curious, 20,000 rupees a month salary, 2,500 rupees a month rent. What are you getting in 2,500 rupees a month rent? What does this house look like?
I mean, it varies, because like that's why my range also moved from like 12 to 18%. It comes with all those what people look at from like the basic minimum requirement. What is the adequacy? What is the size of the household? Like what are the trade-offs? Are they looking at like home-based work, or because someone like coming from migrants and street workers, and they also need to carry their stuff. So where is that coming from? So that's one of the thing. And like the proximity is something like everyone look at. One of the main thing for rental housing is like how far away, what are they using mode of transport, where are they located, what is the place of work. So they're trading off with the proximity to the work and house together, and like they're compromising multiple things. So one of the major compromise they do over here is the affordability, because there are multiple other factors, and that leads to a question of the quality. So closer to the work, and like this is the budget that I have. So they are reaching that affordability wala question. Like I
Right.
come up with that budget because I need to like do some savings, take it back to my
Right.
village or somewhere.
And then making
like
all
that.
these trade-offs, right? The minute you cross that 18% rent, you're compromising on education, you're compromising on food, you're compromising on other kinds of investments of that household. So that tightness of trade-off is going on.
Yes.
I have another question on, I think that many people also have in their mind, which is, does it, does EMI work the same way as rent? And I have a feeling that our EMI rates are much closer to 30% of monthly income than this 18% of rent. And that creates a different distortion in the upper end of the market. We'll come back to that in a second. So guys, we have these two starting points, right? 4 is to 5 times annual household income, say 20% of monthly income. And we've got these kind of ratios. But the second part is then, we're also saying that we know that in our cities, many folks are struggling to make this. Most of our workers are struggling to make it. Most of our residents are struggling to make it. So when we look at then the form question, what does the stock look like? Sai, you started talking about compromising in the adequacy of the stock. And we know that if the developer is thinking 60 lakhs and the person is saying 15 lakhs. So, Namrata, what is the kind of affordable housing stock that's in? Where are people living now between these compromises in affordability and adequacy?
So I'll give you an example from practice. Actually, this is somewhere around 2013. For like Monitor Inclusive Markets had come up with this report trying to understand whether developers are trying to enter this affordable housing market.
That's right.
And what they did is they basically went to some 9 different cities and they looked at housing which is less than 10 lakh, which they sort of like back calculated to fall within that definition of affordability for EWS segment. And what they realized is basically that this housing is coming up on the outskirts of the cities, in the peri-urban areas. And while that might work for second-tier cities, like when it came to first-tier cities like Bombay, etc., like it was half the way to Gujarat almost. Yes. So it is small format housing which is on the peri-urban areas of the city. And then we realized later when we did research, we realized that this housing stock, which had come up briefly between 2009 to 2013, 14, actually began to drop. And so an ANAROC report that came out recently, in fact, says that between 2019 and now, the affordable housing has in the formal developer segment has fallen. Small format housing has fallen from 40% to like around some 16%. So this is a declining trend right now.
The market is not even making that 260 lakh. Not even that. Given the attention on it.
So this 10 lakh to bhul jao, abhi to 60 lakh bhi nahi bana rahe hain, like that kind of a thing. So what, like Sai was speaking earlier, so what people end up doing is sort of, you see the dominant form of affordable housing in our cities is this incrementally built housing that people build either on their own lands or on, bastis on lands which belong to governments or even private developers. And here you see incrementality plays a very important role, right? Like, because if you understand, if you are in the formal sector, then you can actually take a loan and then you pay off your loan over time through EMIs. But if you are somebody who is in the informal sector working, you don't even get loans. And so you're sort of, building a small house and then incrementally bit by bit as you get money, improving on that house. And so when I mean improving on the house, this housing is not necessarily pakka housing in one go. Like, so it might be the walls are pakka and the roof is kacha, and as you get money, the roof becomes pakka. So it is being incrementally built. Rooms may be added. This is the kind of housing you're seeing.
The kind of uncertainty then during that time.
Absolutely. And this kind of housing is sort of, but you'll see that, bastis will often be much closer to the places of work, will be closer to transit. But they will, if you look at the maps and the geographies, they will be along nalas. They will be along, lands that people are sort of neglecting or not looking at.
That's why that land was vacant in the first place. And so therefore you have this kind of mix of where the land was risky, you get an opportunity to self-build, but then you have to live and absorb that risk in a way over time.
Over time that has to be. So this is the kind of housing which is more dominant and you'll see that, and within them you'll see sort of it's not just living, but there's also sort of a live work kind of relationship with the house.
And like Sai was saying, many of these places could be risky, but they're also typically near work.
Yeah.
They're also typically still in central city locations because people don't want to make that trade-off with being too far away.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting in some ways, and we think of that first thing that you said as the housing market, formal developer built. But the self-built housing is also a housing market, right? And I think one of the things that we've always struggled with is not to separate the reality of how affordable housing is actually built in this country, whether by people, whether by market, whether by the state, right? And to think of these as all as means of production, all of whom are in a way trying to solve a housing problem. With pluses and minuses. So the developer builds it well, but has to build it far. Right? The informal self-built housing builds it near, but has to compromise on its adequacy and risk over time. So you start to outline these kinds of tensions. In one sense, why are we not seeing so much more rental in that way? I mean, what is it that then, what is the structure of the opportunity to get a good rental house, to get it in the way you want it? Is it a market that is favorable? Does it invite people? Are people able to say, you know what, I can't afford to buy yet. Let me rent for a while and I will be safe and I will do other things. Like, does rental have the same uncertainties as ownership?
Yeah, it do. I mean, like specifically, like if you look at like national numbers of like national urban rental proportion is almost like 37% of the rental housing stock. But if you take the stock, for example, if you take Bangalore case, there's roughly around 60% of the housing stock is in rental. The rented households.
Up to 60%.
Up to 60.1 something. So over there, what's happening is like most of the migrants are mostly like it can be inter and intrastate, but when people migrate from like urban to urban, majority of them are like rural urban migrants and all. When the migrants in specifically low income segment migrate to city like Bangalore or Chennai, where rental housing proportion is higher, they always face two big challenges. One is social capital, and another one is financial capital. So when migrants come up, again, like if you look at the higher end or the middle end segment, they will find some of their family members, friends, family friends, or someone, and like they can enter into the city and like. So the first step is always like a bit. I'm not telling it's easy, but like some comfort, some cushion is there.
Even if you're coming in the elite market, you can use networks, you can online sites, you can find references. There are ways to find the stock.
Yes.
But as a migrant worker, you're saying it's not that simple to find the stock.
Yeah, because one, the big challenge is like that labor market and like all those things. You also don't have any connects from your native or something. And the second one, they also don't have financial capital. So this stuck up between all these things. Where are people going? What is where are they staying? And like, what are they doing? That's why that initial step is always challenge. At the same time, majority of them are like entry-level workers. Entry-level. It can also be like, I'll also take that like consider under your minimum wage component that you just now highlighted. Most of the ITS workers also earn that. The entry-level is also like the equivalent to
That's right. Even in the formal sector, the incomes are not always what we think.
Exactly. And specifically like cities like Bangalore and Chennai specifically. Over there, what happens is like the moment when folks migrate and like come to this city, if we keep the social and financial capital aside, there are multiple other discriminations that are coming up. One, mainly everyone sees that like if you are a single migrant, for example, everyone will say that like we give our house only to like married. So marital status comes over there, gender comes over there, and discrimination from like what kind of food pattern, vegetarian, non-vegetarian.
Vote for religion and caste, strongly, absolutely.
Yeah, and so all these things, again, like if all these things come up and places like Bangalore and Hyderabad have one more layer on top of it, all this discrimination, which with an additional top of like 10 months of secure deposit.
You kind of have a high barrier of entry. You need a deposit, you need networks, you need to know the stock, and you need to be able to come in. So it's interesting that normally you think of capital as a barrier to ownership and asset ownership. But capital is also a barrier to rent, right? Which is exactly meant to offer that flexibility. And I think it's important for us to remember here that we still don't have either comprehensive national rent regulation or anti-discrimination protection, for example, right?
Yeah.
That actually prevents then the market in both sides, where we know high degrees of identity and caste and religion-based segregation exists in our cities.
Yeah.
But we don't have anti-discrimination protection that stops a landlord from saying, actually, if you're a single bachelor who eats meat, right, which is code for so many things in our polity, there's often no legal recourse.
Yeah.
And so it's also not about just the economics of the market. It's the legal regulation of the market. It's the social dynamics that structure the market. It's not only I have the money, I'll get it. There are then 5 more layers to kind of jump. So, guys, if we start framing this crisis now, we've talked about the affordability, adequacy kind of tension. We've talked about the location tension. So let's get now to this crisis. Like, if you were to say, here's all these different things going on. So here's what really we're struggling with. And you know, the three of us have talked about these ideas of adequacy, affordability, viability as a way to think about it. So now let's start with you. What would be the language of you saying, look, here's actually what the crisis is. Here's what we need. Here's what we don't have. Here's what we really need to begin to fix.
Yeah. So, yeah, I feel like the crisis is as crisis is defined, and like you said, you know, IHS has always framed it as affordability, adequacy, and viability. And in the case of like inadequate housing within bastis, this inadequacy is quite multidimensional. So it's not just so if you start looking at the word, there is the day-to-day inadequacy. So you know there is access to infrastructure. So whether it is you know, water, clean water, toilets, etc. Amenities, like do you have clinics around, do you have like, you know, access to schools, etc. So there is that kind of inadequacy. Of course there is the material inadequacy, which we have spoken about quite a bit now. There is sort of like, you know, as we start thinking about climate change coming in and disasters becoming like, you know, more frequent event.
And we go back to the location of these settlements on those risky environmental geographies, the low-lying plains. Yeah.
You see that, you know, from the perspective of disasters, you have, it's these places which will sort of like bear the brunt of the disasters often. But there is also sort of the material being inadequate also means that there is the everyday, you know, challenge of heat risk. And there is also one more kind of challenge, which is that of like, you know, the type of housing. Often what happens is that the governments will try to step in and they'll say that, you know, okay, you're on you know, you're on land which is not tenable, and so they'll move you into housing, and then they'll put a lot of people into housing, which is, you know, 1 BHK, 2 BHK in apartment sort of typologies. And you know, we've seen extremes where when people are moved into apartment typologies of this sort, in resettlement colonies of Mumbai, you're seeing instances of tuberculosis which are rising, and so there is that kind of an extreme risk. But there is also sort of, you know, the sort of inadequacy of the type where if you want to do home-based work, the 1 BHK is not giving you enough space. Like, you know, there is not enough thought put into what kind of typology, which is also an architectural question.
Because the earlier informal settlements were also economic zones. They were also offices. They were also karkhanas and warehouses. They were dhabas and restaurants. They were not just homes.
And speaking about like, you know, being able to put a room on top of your house and then incrementally and then renting that out. That's a way in which people generated incomes. And so inadequacy can also be sometimes, you know, where government interventions are made and some things get improved, but a new set of problems then begin to emerge out of it.
And then this tension also between, you know, do we build X number of units? You know, and this kind of question of shortage is a very common way to think about the crisis. So it becomes like a very short X 100 units, we build 100 units. But the question is, it's not just the unit, like what you're saying. You're building housing, you're building settlements and work and location, right? And that's that kind of tension that comes up really, really powerfully. And I remember actually that same Kundu committee report, the technical report, you had this really lovely line that we quote back and forth a lot, that the housing question in India is that affordable housing is inadequate and inadequate housing is affordable, right? Like you have this trick, like the minute I can afford it, it falls. And the minute like it gets better, it gentrifies and becomes unaffordable. And it's like any way you move, there is that tension of this crisis, you know, and I think that's such an important part of it. Sai, for rent, is the crisis a little bit different for rent than for what type of unit do I produce? What is the should I price it at? Who can buy it? And the fact that we have lots of people who cannot enter the housing market, that's our crisis, right?
Yeah.
And are trading off now between affordability and adequacy. What happens with rent?
It's a similar story and like a bit worse. So we hear
Oh, it's a good way to start. We can only go one direction. I promise our last question is about hope and how to get better. Before we go down one time, then we'll come back up.
Yeah. So I mean, most of the housing stock, like I'll go back to the Kundu Committee report in the end, but like one thing that I would like to highlight is like where are these housing coming? Because like and what are rental housing? Majority of the rental housing stock that are available in the market are not new.
Yeah.
They are old. In majority of the cases, they are old, dilapidated, or like not dilapidated, but like somewhere in that census definition of like it won't be in the good condition, but it'll be in the livable condition with minor leakages, infrastructure issues, and all those things. But you can hardly find any new stock. And if you look at like Kundu Committee report, because that's the recent one, like that talks about vacancy and other issues, where we know that like lots of vacant stock are there, both census and all other data highlights. But parallelly, where are these vacant stock coming up?
Right.
And whose vacant stock? The vacant stock that are affordable, like what Namrata just now said, that like which are affordable, which are accessible, are in the periphery of the city. But the ones which are in the city, but they are vacant. And those stocks are again like they are mostly like either second houses,
there's speculation, they're part of the real estate financialization,
investment, and all those things. That's where this whole question of like your question, like what is the scene of like affordability, adequacy, viability, and we keep discussing about like is it a or factor and like but why it's always n factor. The challenge between that is affordability and adequacy and viability, or like why that or factor that we keep discussing is that's where it's coming up. The one which is affordable, the one which is adequate enough for a migrant is always in the periphery. The one which is affordable and the one which is adequate and viable, which is in the city, are just lying vacant. And like because even the middle income and
it is really peculiar that even markets where you feel like there's no room to breathe always have vacancy. I mean, in the European markets now, this has come out of Airbnb in European cities that has caused deep rental vacancy. So actually, every housing market struggles with this kind of malregulation and misalignment. It's not just a question of southern cities and only housing poverty, right? For us, our inequality makes housing a particular challenge. But actually, this challenge is in markets even in the global north, even in the North American region. And I think one thing also I feel like when I hear you, Sai, I also feel like in some ways for ownership, affordability, adequacy is the bigger fight, right? But in rent, it's viability. It's that location. It's that proximity to transport. It's that nearness to work, right? Because workers are coming to cities for work. They're not coming for that quality housing. And I think that distinction is sort of interesting. So, this is the moment where we begin to, begin to sort of, begin to wrap up our end of things. And so it'd be good for you to, I can see questions starting coming in the Q&A box, feel to add. But I want to get a set of questions now from us, a last set of reflections from both of you on practices, on ways forward. Like, how do we break this cycle a little bit, right? And again, there are multiple things to do, but if we would take a couple of ideas. So let me start with you. You do a lot of work on shared rental housing. You do a lot of work on things like, people making housing for construction workers in the market, student housing, PG housing, dormitory housing. And we know that actually a lot of the housing that workers take, and not just like workers to students to etc., are not family-based homes only, right? So this idea of shared rental housing, do you feel like it could be something that is able to fix the viability problem a little bit, improve a little bit? Is this market doing well? What would it mean to support this market? How could policy support this market? So talk to us about shared rental housing.
Yeah, I'd like to start with this. The moment when we say that like PGs and private hostels and shared rental housing, again, all of them are like rightly you said, it's for the low income, but like, are they defined in any of the government statutory documents? So first, they are not recognized. They are not registered or identified or notified.
Unregulated, actually, in many ways.
It's in that it's in that area of like
Right.
people are telling that like no, it's not residential. None of the statutory documents across all the states, though housing is a state subject, none of the states or national level they talk about it. And then the second component is like, okay, if it's not residential, then it's commercial.
Right.
But like, are they earning profits? Because they
That's
are
right.
catering to the bottommost
Especially
segment.
at this low income shared rental housing, right?
Yes.
That's not just the PG and the upper end student households, but it's
Yes.
like housing for security guards in
Security
Bangalore,
guards,
right? It's
yes.
housing for construction workers that are collective, good quality, adequate housing,
Yes.
near work,
Yeah.
affordable.
Yeah.
But then the supply, but then if the profits are not there, can these companies survive? Can this market grow?
No, that not at all. Like majority of them, like we have seen during COVID. Unfortunately, the things that comes in newspaper articles and all are like the what tenants are facing, what are the issues that
Right.
tenants face, and like tenants are not getting this, that, and all. But operators are also facing equal amount or like more than
Right.
equal amount of like challenges. Like I told you, because of this lack of regulation and recognition or identification, them as like the operators as a part of the housing thing, because here the ones who are operating these facilities are neither owners, landowners or property owners, nor they are tenants. They are just an operator. Where if you look at any of the housing document, rent acts, anywhere, there's always a tenant and a owner.
This middle manager is not there.
The person
Right.
who runs the building, runs the facility, that person is not there. And unfortunately, one is the operational side. And your question of like the rental housing thing, neither the government, none of the master plans or like any other statutory they don't talk about like there's no reservation of land, reservation of zoning. There's no category for like rental housing or like specifically for like
Or even worker housing.
worker
There was a
housing.
moment in industrial cities where we had worker
Worker
housing. We've
housing.
lost both
Yeah.
of those
Those
forms.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And later, in the recent 53rd GST Council, also similar conversation happened. Like, why? I mean, like after a couple of debates from last 4 years, now in the 54th GST Council in September, they exempted. They have thought of like giving exemption of on GST for PGs, but is still in the process. That's a positive news. But parallelly, there are lots of debates in the same document that like, why aren't we recognizing them as housing? The reason for recognizing a PG as a housing component is the major challenge is like their utilities and services.
That's right.
Because all of them pay
Commercial
commercial,
bills.
electricity,
Yeah.
water
Exactly.
supply, property tax, and all those
So
things.
they're being treated like hotels for tax.
Exactly.
They're actually trying to
Exactly.
do low income rent.
Low
Yeah.
income. And the proportion is like the utility bill, if you sum up all these 4 or 5 components, it's almost like 3 times the same thing of this. So people will say that like, how much do you pay for electricity bill? What is the proportion of property tax that you pay? But when you sum it up, that 3 times is the profit that these guys require. Right now, most of these operators
Right.
who all are surviving right now are surviving very thin profit margin. That's why you can't see any of these uh, institutional investors or any private or corporate people providing housing for the low income segment.
But do you kind of feel like if we got the regulation better,
Yeah.
that this market could actually cater to affordable, adequate, viable housing for workers?
Yeah, it do. I said, like even if they might be paying some 300, 400 rupees as a cumulative per month electricity or something, and if it right now they might be paying some 1,000 rupees, and if this thing become into a residential component, it comes down to like the 1/3 proportion.
The
You get
margins
300
get
rupees.
created. That's
So
right.
that 300
Yeah.
rupees will like right now, most of them on an average across Bangalore, Chennai, Pune, and Hyderabad, they're earning a profit margin of like 7 to 10%.
Right.
And like that too, very few.
Makes them very vulnerable.
Yeah,
to risk. I mean, they wouldn't have survived COVID.
Survived
They
COVID.
wouldn't have survived
Yeah.
any economic shock.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this small percent, like,
Right.
is it a small percent? Yes, it is. But that pushes from that 7 to 10% to 12 to 15%. It might not attract larger investors and all.
It's interesting because actually, every time we think about market approaches to housing, people go straight to developers
Yeah.
and large scale, like elite developers. But between the state and people built housing are these smaller markets, the small p of the private, where pushing could actually create something in some ways, right? So, Namrata, if I come to you, you outlined these two kinds of markets, this formal developer-led.
Yeah.
What can we do for that slide of formal develop? Because we want the formal market to produce housing. Everything cannot be people-built. That's by putting all the responsibility on communities. But the other hand, people are building their own housing. They are incrementally doing it. So, what do we do to support people-led housing, and what do we do to let developers give us more affordable housing and try and get it down from the 60 closer to the 12, but anything actually in this market? So one idea for each of these.
So very quickly, actually, what can we do for people-led housing? This question has actually got an answer somewhere in the 70s by, people's movements and anti-eviction campaigns, where basically they're saying that if land is the problem, just give them land. Just regularize the land on which they're sitting. And what is good is that somewhere around 2005 onwards, this idea got a lot of traction, and states like Odisha, Karnataka, MP has started
scale pattas, large-scale land titling. Absolutely, the core approach of it.
Absolute simple core approach. But while this happens, there's also evictions in Delhi.
That's right.
And so this is not being sort of uniformly done. The second problem with that is that, people are not building on top of this approach. So while we might be giving pattas to houses, we also need to find out ways of upgrading the entire basti.
That's right.
Because, just giving a patta is not enough. You need to be able to sort of ensure that there is sewage lines, there's electricity lines, there's drainage, water. And that is the kind of approach that we need to build on. Right?
So land titling and then upgrading.
Right.
And the formal market?
For the formal market, I think that sort of like a cocktail of mandates and sort of incentives would be good. On the mandate side, I feel like Karnataka has a problem where sort of, we did try to enforce developers to make affordable housing, and that mandate was stayed, which is a problem, and we need to kind of find ways to get out of it. But on the incentive side, one is also that we need to stop thinking of developers as only private developers. The state needs to come in and build as well. And the state can get into PPP kind of, negotiations.
Leverage its own public land holdings for affordable housing.
Absolutely. But the second thing I think is also sort of ensuring that these are spatially, good places to actually build. So incentivize housing which comes around transit-oriented development corridors, next to, bus stops, etc. And actually, because we've been talking housing, we haven't spoken about this, but I think transit plays a very, very important role in this entire equation, because it's if you can build a very strong, robust system of buses, of suburban rails, of even metro,
viability stretches.
And that, especially buses, in the peri-urban areas, sort of, having good bus routes can actually really help, and leveraging government land. You already know government land exists here. Housing might come up. Put the bus line there, and invest in buses. That's it's a very big push to affordable housing through buses.
Okay, so it's a lot of ideas from us. There's crisis, but there's also practice, there's also opportunity. And I hope you also get a sense a little bit of the many ways in which we talk about housing in a place like IIHS University. The social angle of it, the land angle of it, the planning angle of it, the economic angle of it, the taxation, GST council angle of it, the environmental risk of it, the impact on climate on it. And that's kind of that mix of interdisciplinary thinking of analysis that we really hold ourselves to here. And housing is something that is a core focus of our Masters in Urban Economic Infrastructure Development. It's also a core part of our Masters of Urban Studies and Practice. And affordable housing is part of our Masters in Human Development Policy and Practice. So transit is part of our Masters, again, on Urban Economic Infrastructure Development. So if you're interested in these kinds of questions, ihs.ac.in is a place to go. So let me turn to questions here, and let's take some of them. I think we didn't do too badly. We have about 15 minutes. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll read them out. So the first question is, what is your take on the redevelopment of low-cost affordable housing such as MHADA, which is the Maharashtra Housing and Development Agency, and other housing board flats? Land is utilized better, housing quality improves. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but so Namrata, I'll come to you on this. What do you think about, you just said developers are not just private, right? So MHADA, housing boards in all states could also be development. So what do we think about the building of low-cost affordable housing by the state?
Absolutely support it. I feel like one of the important things is that you look at the low income person as the client you're building for, and then, sort of get into understanding what kind of spaces are required, for what happens in a lot of SRA is that it's like the byproduct, right? Like in the sense that actually you're trying to redevelop the land and,
SRA, you mean Bombay Slum
Bombay
Rehabilitation
slum
PPP
rehabilitation.
scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. And, profits for the developer get sort of emphasized, but just to ensure that, as a byproduct, you have like this free housing which is given. And we are seeing like, there are studies which say that there are resettlement colonies where tuberculosis has been rampant because of this kind of, push towards putting a large density of housing in without much light and ventilation. And that's not housing.
So that challenge remains. And the second part of this question also is for the history of how public state housing that has been built, we also know that there's been a history of neglect. So the question also is saying, what about the redevelopment of those housing units that were built that may be peripheral, but could actually create a stock if we actually went in and said, look, we built these in the 80s and 90s, they're not in great shape now, but let's do a repair, retrofit, redevelopment.
No, absolutely. And we need to find out ways in which we sort of start thinking about this long-term maintenance of this housing, right? Like, so right now we've just spoken about the sort of production of housing, but there is this entire question of long-term maintenance of housing, which is a very important rental housing question. It's a very important sort of government housing question. It's also a very important sort of question when it comes to seniors, because, when you buy into housing for seniors,
it deteriorates with you.
And then you just don't
current aging,
capacity to take care of housing which is deteriorating. So how do you think about maintenance models is a part of this entire.
And I think the question, one of the questions asks about how do we play with this risk that if you improve housing that is affordable and adequate, it peripheralizes the poor. It kind of separates them out, but they're getting better stock. And I think, in some ways, actually, to, this question, it's not just us conceptually who thinks of this trade-off. Every household makes this trade-off differently. Some households will agree to compromise on viability and distance for a pakka house, but other households will not make that. So actually, one of the things we have to do both as researchers and policymakers is to accept that people make trade-offs differently, that we cannot decide in a policy which is the acceptable trade-off to make and not. Our job is to expand those set of options. So if the folks that are willing to make the trade-off for distance for a pakka house, they will go. But the folks that are not need to have an option that's inside the city. So I think the question is to anticipate the trade-off and also say people have a right to those priorities in their lives, right? And to compensate between those two things in some way. So I think so how do we think about expanding the options so the trade-offs are the lightest that they can be? But no two people will take the same. I mean, for a lot of redeveloped housing that was peripheral, we also have previous public housing projects that have 70% vacancy and 30% occupancy after JNNURM. Because people abandoned pakka housing in the periphery and said, even when they tried, they couldn't make it work. Too far from work. So I think that's also the tension about the fact that this trade-off also comes over time in some ways. It's a complicated but a very nice question. Let me pick one more. So one more here says, let me take a question from here, which says, okay, it's 4-part question. I'll pick one part of it. How does fragmentation in land ownership and jurisdiction create difficulty in coordination? That's a really good point. And what are processes, and Sai, I'll ask you to take this one. What are the ways in which one enumerates migrant informal workers? Like, how do we know where they are? Are there enumerations? Are we able to track the demand? Because they're also moving, you said, they're without registration. So how do we enumerate migrant informal workers? Let me take the first one on fragmentation in land. I think this is what actually within urban and rural India housing question really remarkably shifts. Because in rural India, a lot of the housing question is about landlessness and historical caste-based landlessness, and then subdivision of landed property across class and caste barriers. But in urban India, actually, because of much of our development outside cities in Maharashtra and Gujarat, we still have very large banks of municipal and publicly owned land in our cities. This is something I think we don't pay enough attention to. We don't have that much private fragmentation of land holding like rural India does. Land reform and breaking zamindari and breaking land hoarding is actually much harder in rural India in some ways. Now, in Ahmedabad and Bombay, this is not true. Private land ownership is very high. But outside Gujarat and Maharashtra, where historically historical reasons. In Bangalore, for example, 80% of slums in Karnataka are not only on public land, they're on ULB land, urban local body land. And even in Bangalore, it's 55%. So actually, fragmentation is not as much of a fight in urban India if public state agencies are willing to use public land to build low income housing for the public. Now, our tension is that we don't want to use that land for that housing. We want to use it for either other kinds of infrastructure, sometimes genuinely conflicting needs, because we also have to build the infrastructure, right? But sometimes we also want to use it for development and exchange value and extract profit and capital out of that land, right? So I think that actually land fragmentation is a very interesting question, but we are still in a moment right now where public land ownership in Indian cities could solve much of our affordable housing crisis. But that moment in the last 20 years is decreasing. More deregulation, more disinvestment, more privatization of public land holdings, and slowly we're losing this opportunity. Sai, how do we track informal migrant workers?
Yeah, that's one tricky question. Even where most of them are like struggling right now because like NSS keep there was a bunch of people institutions and data that talks about seasonal migrants and all. When you talk about like informal migrant workers, it'll be like two types. One, seasonal migrants who come like we keep discussing about like this a separate segment called blue top settlements that you can frequently see in every city. People randomly say that like it's in any other basti, but it's not a typical basti,
Right.
because there in this blue top settlement specifically, people just pay rent only for the piece of land. So those kind of bastis are not recognized or notified by the slum board.
Right.
And when these enumerators go and try to track, that settlement is not visible in any of the maps.
Right.
So where are they going? Where are they sitting? Where are they staying? Again, like to track the work and all, there are a bunch of like most of them go to like construction work, seasonal migrants, majority of them they are there. But like those things can track from the other side, from the employer side. But if you want to look from like the housing side, this migrant
becomes
informal
very
migrant
difficult.
very difficult.
But what's interesting is that you have proxy methods. Like we know that Surat has a certain set of powerloom industries where there's a geography.
Exactly.
We know where workers come into Bangalore during particular times and where they go in industrial areas of the city. So what's interesting also methodologically, this is also a space for innovation, right? You track certain industries and not certain housing. You don't have registration databases, but you know ठेकेदार and contractor networks, right? So I think we also have to get better at finding the source to destination kind of networks out. And luckily, migration tends to have patterns of kinship and recognition and networks. So once you track them, there is a bit of move. But we don't have a lot of portability in our recognition softwares, right? Our Aadhars don't travel. Our ration cards don't travel. Our proof of address does not travel. It's been interesting to watch this e-Shram new worker recognition identity come up, where in some ways you can say, this is not giving me much. But then it becomes a kind of portable work identity ID. So it's interesting to also say that, and the census, for example, is one of the places that doesn't help us much here, because we just ask people, do you live where you were born? But mobility is not that. There's so much more dynamic. We haven't wrapped our head around it actually in some ways.
Actually, I remember somebody who was trying to study how when telephone, when mobile networks move from one state to the other, if there's a way to, map that out. Yeah, that'd be quite interesting.
And COVID reminded us how important those kinds of databases are that have that movement. So really, you're putting your finger on a real important challenge. Okay, let me take one. Namrata, this one for you. Hong Kong model shifted informal settlements into multi-story, quote-unquote, coffin houses. We have all seen the pictures of Kowloon City and the really high densities. Allowed them to legally live close to work. Then once they earn more, they could upgrade to a better home. This also freed up more land from slums. Could this work in India? Large, dense, multi-story, like Hong Kong levels. Could it work?
So this is actually an interesting question, actually. The other place where the TB papers were found were from Hong Kong. So when we were looking at, if there was literature on tuberculosis within cities, there was, of course, Bombay, we were doing the study, and then we found papers from Hong Kong. So just to be a little bit a little bit careful about this. But I feel like some of this is actually what shared rental housing is doing already within our cities. So
it's not the same rise, but it's the same density.
Same density. Shared rental housing is doing that. We also don't want to go very, very high rise, because as you rise high, your maintenance also increases, your sort of cost of giving amenities, infrastructure also sort of like goes up. So there is a certain trade-off between height and affordability that is there, which also has to be sort of taken into consideration. The third thing is that it is also about maintenance over time. So a lot of public housing is maintained by the state in cities like Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. And whether our experience has been the same, like has the
Whether the
state been able
lift
to
works
whether the
after
lift
6 months.
works.
That's the thing. I mean, in so
Absolutely.
many high-rise, low-income housing in Bombay, the whole question was, once the lift goes,
Yeah.
the cycle of repair is itself, it goes around. It's one of the simplest reasons why the maintenance question is actually not asked often in the high-rise question, but it's core to it.
So in that sense, that to get the numbers, you can get it with this, but then
will
it
it
is life
sustain?
that needs to be
I
sustained.
also want to say one thing that's important about that is also to think about that comparison, right? Where so many of our comparisons tend to be very metropolitan. In Hong Kong, it also works because that large building is not socially out of sync with the rest of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
The entire city is built like that, right? So if you think of social cohesion, if you think of status, if you think of mobility, it fits. So in Bombay, you can even ask that question. But the minute you leave, forget metropolitan city, the minute you leave Bombay, that kind of verticality does not have the same roots in urbanism. And in non-metropolitan small towns, it's obviously a non-starter question. So I think there's also a need to sort of say, what can I move from Hong Kong? I can't move from Hong Kong to India. I can maybe move to one or two cities in India and one or two neighborhoods in those cities. But we also know how to do density, which is not the way Hong Kong does density. So actually, it'd be interesting to think of medium rise, high density as our contribution to the Hong Kong model instead of taking that model in. But I think it's an interesting provocation.
Housing crisis.
It's on housing crisis.
Housing crisis
In many kinds of ways, but it has migration control, which we don't have, which is most important to Singapore and Hong Kong. Okay, I'm going to ask out two questions here, and then we'll answer them quickly because we've only got about 5 minutes, so we'll just read through. So one question is about the redevelopment of Dharavi and questions of people having very little power and say in that development. So how do we approach large housing transformation when decision making is very privileged and opaque? So questions of transparency. I'm just going to ask three of them in a row, and then we can do one last round of responses. The second is when people are rehabilitated from informal bastis, their cost of living can potentially increase. That's right. So we've been talking about how adequacy gets better, affordability goes down in some ways. How do we rehabilitate in a way that is sustainable, right? How does upgrading not cause higher costs? I mean, that's one thing to think about. And the last is considering increasing heat stress over the years. How might thermal comfort in dense urban housing be taken into account? Are there existing design and policy regulations to ensure housing that comes up a resistance to heat stress? Thank you. All great questions. Why don't I take the first one on redevelopment? So I think that one of the questions about all kinds of redevelopment, whether it is a scale of Dharavi, whether it's a scale of a single small settlement in another Indian city, those principles of consent that are enshrined into law have increasingly in complex unequal societies are the first compromise that is made, right? Consent can be manipulated. It can often be true, but it can also come under deep constraints and choice. But also very often what happens, like you're saying in the question, is that choice is being made with very limited information that's coming only incrementally. And I think that particularly in large complex markets, the question of transparency, the question of governance participation are as central as the material infrastructure upgrade designs. And I think that in unequal societies like ours, power is centrally playing and stacked against folks who have built those housing. So I think it's an anticipation, it's a core part of why universal slum upgrading is not easy, because actually those questions of coercion and consent are very, very fraught in both ways. And I think that it's not just Dharavi. I think Dharavi gets a lot of attention, but actually even everyday redevelopment projects in cities across where we work, we have exactly this problem, right? And part of the problem comes from people saying, well, you should be grateful for anything you get because anyways you occupied this land, right? So there is also this initial accusation that workers who have built their housing in our cities are illegitimate, they're encroachers, they're slum dwellers, right? Which lots of echoes also of questions of caste, gender, religion, and social status and power. So actually this question of consent and participation is rooted in social inequalities that we've got to front and center, and that's where the fight becomes really complicated. Sai, do you want to think a little bit about experience around, does upgrading always have to make housing more expensive? Is there a way to do improvements in infrastructure that don't necessarily lead to gentrification?
Yeah, I mean, because PMAY started with that enhancement as one of the major
That's right.
component. Unfortunately, they have removed it. But like it do a lot. Like Namrata rightly mentioned that thing of like O&M as one of the key challenge that we have also seen across Jharkhand and even
That's
in
right.
Bangalore also we have seen that like how these the moment when a house gets transformed and like no one takes care their lights and bulbs, common area bulbs and all keep missing. So that small initiative of like that slight repair and like increase in the infrastructure and those are very small components.
And they don't
They
necessarily lead to immediate gentrification. I think that's an important. I think that's a really important thing, that upgrading is not redevelopment.
redevelopment.
Right? So when you improve infrastructure and services, you can improve the quality of housing a lot. And it will take some time before that turns into market assets, right? And I think that period of intervention, this is true of, upgrading examples from Brazil, from Latin America, from Thailand, like global examples have shown that actually a generation benefits first. And then after that, actually, even folks who have a right to sell.
Exactly.
And then it's not gentrification, because with land titling, they get that asset value.
Yeah.
They actually are able to enter into wealth for once
Yeah.
after ages. So the question is time. I think when improvement happens too quickly,
Yeah.
gentrification is really a risk.
True.
But if it happens with that same pace of infrastructure first,
Yeah.
then it doesn't have that same risk of gentrification.
And also the cost factor.
The cost factor is very important. Namrata, heat stress,
Heat-
material, buildings?
I think there is work which is happening around this, which is very important work, and I think it needs to be supported, especially for incremental housing through policy. Right now, it is not. Like right now, if you look at Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, there is some kind of technology innovation grant which is being given for housing built by developers, but there's nothing for beneficiary-led construction housing, which is incremental, and that is where it needs to penetrate. If not coming from the center, then states definitely need to step in and start giving some kind of money for enhancements, which are, till now we've only spoken about material, but it can also be equipment. So it could also be equipment innovations regarding. In Delhi, you see these ACs नहीं है, पर वो
cooler systems, somewhere between this, right?
jute water cooler systems which are coming up. We can think a lot more in that
Absolutely.
direction as well.
Absolutely.
Because at least immediate relief comes through that.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
No, and I think this question also of some of the heat stress questions are our housing policy models, our building codes are not yet moving to say, and partly the problem, I also feel like some of our heat solutions are in stepping away from what we consider modern materials, RCC and glass, and going back actually to materials like bamboo and mud that are much better with heat.
Yeah.
But then it's like almost feel like you're reversing that gaze. But actually, we have to think very seriously about some of these questions. It was very interesting to me after many years of working in more community upgrading, that in community meetings we're now hearing we want drainage, we want toilets, we want electricity, and we want heat insulation roofs. So there is that demand is coming from communities themselves. They're looking for solutions, but they are back to affordability adequacy. That trade-off is going to play out.
Technology plays a very important role here, because now we are saying कि heat stress नहीं होना चाहिए, but we can't only go back to the earlier materials because they might not be disaster resilient. So then you need this tension to sort of be resolved. And so I think innovation from ground up all the way from top down, everything needs to be.
But still, like, unfortunately, like rightly you said, like concrete, people got stuck to those materials because the other bureaucracy issues, like if you're taking a housing loan, banks will come and ask you, you want a PMAY subsidy. They say that like this material. So where's the flexibility? That question was really interesting when they ask any example. Unfortunately, you can't replicate some best case in Mumbai or Ahmedabad, keeping it in
geoclimatic zones are totally different. Heat is playing out differently. Like you should see laterite stone construction in Odisha. You shouldn't see it in Jharkhand. I think that's the trick also that comes in. But really excellent questions. We are at 7. We've done well with time for once, which is great. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to all the people who asked questions. A reminder to you, we're 9 days out from the closure of admissions to this year's admission cycle for our 5 master's programs. Our PhD admissions open on the 20th, so look out for that as well if that's where you are. And thank you, and a safe transit back, hopefully, to as adequate and affordable housing for you as you go home, and may more of us be able to say that. So thank you for joining us today, and we close the webinar today.
Thank you.